Mike, how are you, my friend?
It's always a good day when I'm called a guru, so I'll take it.
You're like the Yoda of recruiting. All right.
As a Star Wars nerd, I will take that comparison all day.
All right, Mike. What are your takeaways from the Syracuse NC State game?
Well, I think it's kind of the third game against a good opponent or a power/good opponent that they've won that it felt like they probably should have won by more. This was a game where the officials kind of handed them 11 points. The 75-yard touchdown that they reviewed, the explanation was kind of nonsense. Now Syracuse blew the coverage on that play. There's no question, but it still should not have counted as a touchdown. And then obviously the field goal situation at the end of the first half, where they said Syracuse lined up over the center, over the snapper, which replay confirms that he did not. So there's some questionable officiating there that kind of made it a little closer than perhaps it should have been. And then Syracuse shot themselves in the foot kind of inside NC State's 30-yard line a few times, went for it on fourth down instead of kicking some field goals. So that made it a little closer than I think just watching it, how it actually felt. But, anytime you win a conference game on the road, something that has been very difficult for Syracuse to do over the last several years, you'll take it. So a good win and, kind of keeps the momentum going from the last couple of weeks.
Mike, we'll get into the offense in just a minute, but what do you make of the play of the defense? They forced 3 turnovers in that football game. They did give up over 400 yards, but I thought that was one of the better defensive performances, especially in a hostile environment on Saturday night.
Yeah, because if you take away 2 long plays, right, the 75-yard touchdown that I just discussed, and then they had a 70-yard pass completion that set up a field goal late. If you take those 2 plays away, you're talking, like 270 to 300 yards of total offense, something like that they allowed. So, and only allowed them in the end zone once. I think you feel. Or twice, I should say. You feel pretty good about the way that defensive performance was. C.J. Bailey ran the ball a little bit more than what he typically does. They started to spy him later in the game, and that kind of took that away a little bit. But overall, you felt really good. I think something that this defense has done a pretty good job of most of the year is keeping teams out of the end zone when they get into the red zone. And when NC State did drive, all 3 turnovers that they forced were deep into Syracuse territory. So once again, it's been that bend but don't break mentality, and that's worked pretty well for the most part. I think UNLV is really the only team that has been able to kind of score consistently, and even in that, 14 of the points that Syracuse gave up were really a direct fault of the special teams. So overall, you feel like the defense is doing some things good. I think there's still some concern about getting pressure other than Fidel Diggs, and I know the fans are still ripping their hair out wanting more pressure instead of the 3-man rushes on opposing quarterbacks. But you still feel like they're making some adjustments here or there. They're going to get reinforcements back with Marcellus Barnes working his way back and Marlo Wax coming back. So hopefully with those 2 guys returning, you feel like this defense could get even better over the next few games.
Does it worry you any about the defensive line injuries?
Yes, of course. I think that was the biggest question mark coming into the season, was how good was the interior of the defensive line and who besides Fidel Diggs would be someone that they could count on to rush the quarterback. And they haven't really answered either of those questions in a positive way yet. It still feels like they're looking for someone else to be a consistent pass rusher. And teams have been able to run the ball pretty well against Syracuse most of the season. So there's still some question marks with those groups, but I feel like they've done some other things that kind of negate how much of an impact that's having. It's not like teams are consistently running for 200-plus yards on Syracuse or scoring 40-plus points a game against Syracuse. So I still think there are some positives from this defense, but there's no question that seems to be the biggest area of concern moving forward.
Yeah, NC State's leading rusher was their quarterback, and C.J. Bailey with 28 yards in the football game. They only ran for 82 yards. Moving to the offensive side of the ball, Jackson Meeks, another big game. 11 catches, 116 yards. It seems like that's Kyle's go-to guy. And don't get me wrong, Aronde Gadsden, he likes to throw the football to on third down. But Jackson Meeks and Kyle have created quite the rapport.
They certainly have, and the most impressive thing about Jackson Meeks is his ability to catch the ball with defenders on him through contact, making tough catches in traffic. That seems to be something that he's really good at. I got a couple texts from some friends while the game was going on and said, man, Jackson Meeks is really good. How did Georgia not use him? And my answer to that is he's just not as explosive of an athlete as what a lot of the guys that they have at the wide receiver position. You think about some guys they've had come through that program, George Pickens somewhat recently, a bunch of guys that they've had come through there. And he's not on that level in terms of being a guy that, you can throw the ball 30, 40, 50 yards downfield on a consistent basis, and he can just out-jump people and run by people, and he's not that type of a player, but he's really, really smart. He has excellent hands, runs great routes, and is someone that clearly Kyle McCord trusts anytime he throws him the ball, and he's turned that into some really strong production ever since Zede Haynes went out with his personal issues that he's dealing with. So I think he's been a huge addition for Syracuse. There's no question about that. And, if you're a Syracuse fan, you're hoping that continues as the season, for the back half of the season.
Paulie and I were talking and kind of joking a little bit. Look, Quinn Allen doesn't even have a 100-yard game this season rushing the football. He ended with 91 yards in this past football game with the touchdown. Like, is that troubling to you, or is it that he's finding other ways and still getting 100 yards? It doesn't matter.
Well, as long as they keep putting up points, this was a game where they could have had, probably 34, 35 points. A couple of other things break their way. They scored 44 against UNLV. Other than the Stanford game, they've been over 30 in every other game. So the offense is scoring. As long as the offense is putting up points, you feel pretty good. And it's not like LaQuinn Allen, as you mentioned, isn't involved. He's the number one ball carrier that they have. When they do run the ball, he's the guy that's going to get the most touches. They find ways to get him involved out of the backfield. He's made some clutch plays, as we saw against UNLV, had another similar type run for his touchdown run against NC State. So I'm not concerned about the lack of 100-yard rushing games. This offense is a passing offense. That's what they are. They put the ball in Kyle McCord's hands and say, put up a bunch of points and put up a bunch of numbers, and he's done that every single game. So as long as that continues, you don't feel like that's something to be overly concerned about.
Let's get into the elephants in the room now. You're 6 games into the season. Special teams hasn't been great. Penalties, you had 8 of them. In the football game. Like, are those the two things that constantly worry you as you head down the stretch here after this bye week?
Penalties, not as much as it has in the past couple of years. That's not to say that it's perfect. I think if you were to get Fran Brown in a room and give him some truth serum and say, what are your thoughts on the penalties? He'd probably say there's still a little more than what he would prefer. But that's my opinion on that. Now, but it hasn't really been as bad as it had been in past years. In past years, you'd have a couple of games where you get 10, 11, 12 penalties. They haven't had that bad. I think this was probably their worst game in terms of penalties, but there were a few of them where they were very questionable. There was, the play right before that field goal that I mentioned that they called Syracuse for lining up over the snapper, even though he wasn't. There was a play where Chase Simmons was rushing after the quarterback, and the NC State offensive lineman grabbed him by the jersey, spun him around, and pulled him to the ground by the jersey right in front of the official. Wasn't called for holding. So that game against NC State, I think you kind of throw out the window because the officiating was just really poor. As far as special teams go, when I wrote one of my keys to victory for Syracuse going into NC State was that they didn't have to be special teams. They just needed to be average teams. And I think they were in this game, honestly. I know they missed the one field goal, but they didn't have a punt block. They made another field goal. They made all of their extra points, and they recovered an onside kick. They didn't give up a huge return to NC State either on kickoffs or the one punt that they had. So I think you feel pretty good if that's what Syracuse's special teams is the rest of the year, no major gaffes, then that's going to help Syracuse win a lot of games because the biggest thing against UNLV was that their special teams mistakes allowed UNLV to stay in a game that Syracuse may have won by 2 scores if not for those mistakes.
The good thing, Syracuse only had to punt the football once in the football game. They did make the change. Jaden O was kicking, a redshirt freshman for Syracuse, instead of Brady Dendenberg kicking field goals against NC State. All right, Mike.
I just want to say one thing about special teams, too, is good news is you're going to Pittsburgh, where kicking is a nightmare.
Anybody, ask Cal's kicker recently.
Ask anybody who's ever kicked into that open end of that stadium. It's not fun.
And the field's a mess, too.
Yeah. Well, come on now. All right. You head into a bye week again at 5-1. Is this where you saw the Syracuse football team could be, or are you a little surprised right now?
It is going into the season. I had them at 5-1 after their first 6 games. Now, I had them losing to NC State as the one loss, because I think going into the season, everyone thought at NC State was going to be perhaps Syracuse's most difficult game, depending on what Miami was at the end of the season. But as the season started to go, you started to watch NC State, you realized they weren't really anywhere close to what teams, people thought that they would be going into the year. And so it's slightly disappointing in that if Syracuse had played anywhere close to what it has in the last couple of games against Stanford, they probably win that game a little bit comfortably. And then you're sitting at 6-0, you're probably a top 20 team, and everything that you wanted to accomplish this offseason is still right in front of you. That said, it's hard to be disappointed being at 5-1, and they've got a golden opportunity to go play another ranked team and pick up another big win against Pittsburgh in a week and a half.
They don't play Pitt, obviously, until the 24th, next Thursday. Do you expect Marlo Wax to be back, and do you expect, big changes maybe defensively with the way they have to shift guys back around?
I do expect him to be back. I just don't know in what capacity, meaning is he going to come out there and start and play, 75% of the snaps? I think that might be a little ambitious to expect right after returning from an injury. I could see him going out there and playing, maybe 35 to 50% of the snaps, maybe going out there and playing just in certain situations, whether it's short yardage situations, you want him out there as a good tackler, as a smart player, or maybe you decide he's one of your better pass rushers and you throw him out there in some 3rd and longs as a secondary pass rusher to Fidel Diggs. That's another option as well. What I'm most interested to see is when he does come back, whether it's this week or I should say next week against Pittsburgh or perhaps the week after against Virginia Tech, when he comes back to his normal role, where does Justin Barron go?
Yeah.
Does he go back to safety? Or does he move over to the other linebacker spot, and now you're taking Derek McDonald off the field? Do you split him between those 2 spots? It's really interesting because I think Devin Grant has been, for the most part, pretty good since he's moved back to safety. And I think Justin Barron's NFL future is at linebacker, and he's been pretty good, had the best game of his Syracuse career this past week against NC State. So it'll be really interesting to see what they do with those guys. At the end of the day, it's not a bad thing to have too many good players. I'm just really curious to see what they do with everybody.
Yeah, Barron 8 tackles, a fumble recovery, a sack, and a interception in that football game.
Mike, want to switch gears with you really quickly. Keon Anthony, a month ago, says, my dad has not told me where I should go or nudged me in any way whatsoever. 2 weeks ago, he narrows it down to 3 schools. When do you think we'll get an announcement on him?
It sounds like he's targeting the first week of November as a decision date. He's already visited Syracuse and USC. I think USC at this point, it's USC and Auburn as the 2 other teams in his final 3 in addition to Syracuse. I think USC is a bigger threat to Auburn. He hasn't visited Auburn yet, and last I checked, he didn't have an official visit scheduled there. He said he was going to try to get there before he makes his decision, but also said that if he doesn't get there, he has spoken to enough players and coaches that he has enough information to make his decision. That doesn't sound to me like a school that's going to be a serious threat to Syracuse. But USC is, mainly because his relationship with their head coach, Eric Musselman, goes back to when Eric Musselman was at Arkansas. Musselman has been recruiting him for years. He has a really good relationship with him, and he has a history of putting guys in the league and Anthony has noticed that. But also, his mom, Lala, lives out in California, so he'd be much closer to his mom there. Now, do I think that's going to ultimately be the end-all, be-all? No, I still think Syracuse is the favorite, but there are certainly some things that are appealing to USC, and that's why I think they're Syracuse's biggest threat. But there's no question that I think everyone pretty much expects Syracuse as the favorite at this juncture, but the important thing to remember is Anthony himself hasn't specifically said that, so at least not publicly. So we'll see how this thing plays out in the next few weeks.
Yeah, Melo might not be telling his son where to go. He's just giving him hints of putting oranges in his lunchbox every day.
Well, I was just going to say, if you text him orange emojis every day, you're not really telling him where to go. You're just,
Hey, do you want an orange for breakfast or for lunch?
That goes back to an inside joke here on our show. It's the potato of
the potato
oranges.
emojis.
Yes. All right, Mike. Good stuff. Next week we'll do a basketball heavy one as we roll into the first exhibition game next week. So it's right
Sounds
there.
like a plan. And Mario, I will see you tonight.
You can catch Mike tonight on our Orange Nation show, Paulie. 7 to 7:30.
News Channel 9.
Very good. Thank you.
Guys
Thanks, Mike.
TV people, so important. We'll take a break. It's ESPN
I still have
Radio.
a face for radio.
It's ESPN Radio. Syracuse, Utica Row, McHughSportsTalk.com.